Something is happening to you, not around you, to you, inside you. You may not have the words for it yet. You may have been calling it stress or restlessness, or a vague sense that something important is missing from the life you have built. You may have noticed that things that used to satisfy you no longer do. That conversations that used to feel meaningful now feel shallow. That the explanations you were given for what life is and what it means have started to feel insufficient, like a map that worked well enough for a while but keeps leading you to places that don't match what you find when you arrive. Or perhaps it is something more specific. A moment of clarity that came out of nowhere. In the middle of an ordinary day, in the shower, driving to work, waking up at 3 a.m, where for just an instant the normal sense of being a separate individual in a world of separate things dissolved, and something else was there instead. Something larger, something quieter, something that felt, paradoxically, more real than ordinary reality. And then it passed, and you were left with the feeling that something important had happened that you did not have a framework to understand. Or perhaps you have simply been asking questions that you cannot stop asking, even when you want to. Questions about the nature of consciousness, about what you actually are, underneath the roles and the history and the personality, about whether the awareness that is reading these words right now is something that your brain produces, or something that your brain is an instrument of, about whether death is the end or a transition, about whether the universe is indifferent, or whether it has something like intention running through it. These are not new questions. They are, in fact, the oldest questions. The questions that every human civilization, in every era and every part of the world, has placed at the center of its most serious thought. The questions that temples were built to explore, that initiatory traditions were designed to answer, that the most rigorous philosophical minds of every culture have spent their lives approaching from every possible angle. And here is what is remarkable about this moment in history. These are no longer only spiritual questions. They are scientific questions. The most advanced physics of the 21st century has arrived through its own rigorous methods at questions about the nature of consciousness that sound remarkably, sometimes almost exactly, like the questions that the ancient traditions were asking 3,000 years ago. Something is happening to your understanding of consciousness. And it is not random. It is not a personal quirk or a symptom of anxiety or a sign that something is wrong with you. It is part of a larger shift. A shift in how human beings understand what they are, what consciousness is, and what the relationship is between the individual mind and the reality it finds itself in. The ancient traditions knew this shift was coming. They mapped it, they prepared for it, they encoded in the language of myth and symbol and sacred geometry and philosophical text exactly what this experience is and what it requires. This video is about that map, about what the ancient Egyptians knew about consciousness, that their entire civilization was built to transmit, about what the Vedic tradition of ancient India understood about the nature of awareness that modern physics is now being forced to confront, about what the quantum revolution in physics has discovered about the relationship between the observer and the observed, and why that discovery sounds so much like something very old. Something is happening to your understanding of consciousness. An ancient wisdom already knew why. Let us begin. For most of the 20th century, mainstream science operated on a set of assumptions so deeply embedded that they were rarely examined. Consciousness was one of them. The assumption was this: consciousness is a product of the brain. It emerges from the complexity of neural activity, from the firing of billions of neurons in patterns of extraordinary intricacy. When those patterns are present, consciousness exists. When they stop, in dreamless sleep, in anesthesia, in death, consciousness ceases. It is an output of biological machinery. It is what the brain does, in the same way that pumping is what the heart does. This assumption seemed so obvious, so well supported by the evidence of neuroscience, that questioning it felt almost irrational. Of course, consciousness is produced by the brain. What else could it be? And then quantum mechanics happened. Not quickly, not in a single dramatic moment of revelation, but gradually, over decades of experimental work and theoretical argument, the physics of the very small began producing results that could not be reconciled with the assumption that consciousness is merely an output of physical processes, that the observer is simply a passive recorder of a reality that exists independently of being observed. The problem began with the wave function. In quantum mechanics, a particle, an electron, a photon, any quantum system does not have definite properties before it is measured. It exists in a superposition of possibilities. All possible states, all possible positions, all possible values simultaneously until an observation is made, until the observer interacts with the system. And then in an instant, the superposition collapses. A single definite result appears. The observer collapses the wave function. The act of looking determines what is there. This is not a philosophical interpretation layered on top of the physics. It is in the mathematics. The equations cannot be made consistent without it. The most precisely verified physical theory in human history, the theory that underlies every piece of modern technology, from the transistor in your phone to the laser in your medical imaging, cannot be fully interpreted without confronting the role of consciousness in the structure of physical reality. John Wheeler, one of the great physicists of the 20th century, spent the final decades of his career working through the implications of this. He coined the term participatory universe. He proposed that the universe is not simply observed by consciousness. It is, in some fundamental sense, brought into being by observation. That the act of measurement, the act of the conscious observer interacting with physical reality, is not an add-on to the universe, but constitutive of it. He drew a diagram, a universe shaped like the letter U. At one end, the Big Bang. At the other end, the observer, looking back across billions of years of cosmic history, collapsing the wave function of the entire universe into definite existence through the act of observation. The universe observing itself into being. Consciousness not as a later arrival in a pre-existing material world, but as the ground from which the material world arises. This is extraordinary. It is also deeply uncomfortable for a scientific tradition that has spent centuries trying to eliminate the observer from its equations. And it is almost word for word what the ancient traditions of Egypt and India had been saying for 3,000 years. The physicist André Lande, one of the developers of inflationary cosmology, the theory that describes the earliest moments of the universe's expansion, wrote the following: "The universe and the observer exist as a pair. I cannot imagine a consistent theory of the universe that ignores consciousness. Cannot imagine a consistent theory of the universe that ignores consciousness. This is not mysticism. This is one of the leading cosmologists of the 21st century, working from the mathematics of the early universe, arriving at the conclusion that consciousness is not incidental to physical reality, that it cannot be factored out, that any complete description of what the universe is must include a description of the observer, of awareness itself. Something is happening to your understanding of consciousness, because the most rigorous science of our era has arrived at a conclusion that changes everything. Consciousness is not what the brain produces. It may be what the brain receives. It may be the field in which the brain and the body and the universe itself exists. And the ancient traditions knew this. They built civilizations around it. The ancient Egyptians did not build the way we build. They did not construct temples and monuments primarily as displays of power, or as tombs for their rulers, or as the products of a civilization with surplus labor and a taste for grand architecture. They built as instruments, as technologies, as physical structures designed to interact with invisible forces in ways that served specific purposes. And the invisible force that Egyptian civilization was most fundamentally organized around understanding, working with, and transmitting across generations was consciousness itself. The Egyptian concept of consciousness was not a philosophical abstraction. It was a practical reality, something that could be cultivated, refined, expanded, and ultimately transformed through specific practices and specific understanding. And their map of consciousness was not simple. It was a multi-layered, precisely articulated description of the different aspects of awareness, what they were, how they related to each other, and what the full development of each aspect required. We have already explored the ka, the ba, and the ak, the three primary aspects of the Egyptian soul that correspond with extraordinary precision to Freud's id, ego, and superego. But the Egyptian understanding of consciousness went deeper than this three-part structure. It included a concept that has no direct equivalent in modern Western psychology, and that maps almost perfectly onto the most advanced theories of consciousness in contemporary physics. The Egyptians called it the Sahu, the spiritual body, the aspect of the human being that, when fully developed, was no longer bound by the limitations of individual perspective, no longer confined to the particular vantage point of this one person in this one body in this one moment. The Sahu was the aspect of consciousness that could participate directly in the universal field, that could know, not through the mediation of the senses and the thinking mind, but through direct participation in the ground of being itself. The development of the Sahu was the highest goal of Egyptian sacred practice. Their entire initiatory system, the rituals of the temples, the teachings of the mystery schools, the practices encoded in the Book of the Dead, and the pyramid texts, was oriented toward this development, toward the cultivation of an awareness so expanded, so refined, so fully integrated, that it could participate directly in what the Egyptians called the field of Netta, the divine intelligence that underlies and permeates all of creation. Now listen to how the physicist David Bohm described what he called the implicate order, the deeper level of reality that he believed underlies the explicit, visible world of separate objects in space and time. Bohm proposed that what we experience as the physical world, as separate objects, separate events, separate people, is a projection from a deeper, undivided reality. A reality in which everything that appears separate is, at the level of the implicate order, one thing, one movement, one field. He called this deeper reality the hollow movement, a word he coined to describe a reality that is both whole and in constant movement, in which every part contains the information of the whole, in which separation is a feature of the projection, not of the underlying reality itself. The Sahu of Egyptian sacred tradition and the implicate order of Bohm's physics are descriptions of the same thing. The aspect of consciousness, or the level of reality, in which the apparent separation between the individual and the whole dissolves, in which the awareness that reads these words and the awareness that is the universe reading itself are revealed as, at the deepest level, one thing. This is not poetry. Bohm developed the mathematics of the implicate order from his work on quantum mechanics. The Egyptians developed their understanding of the Sahu from thousands of years of systematic inner investigation. They arrived at the same description from opposite directions. And the temples they built, the great sacred spaces of Karnak and Luxor and Abydos, were designed not as places of worship in the ordinary sense, but as environments in which the development of the Sahu could be facilitated. Spaces in which the architecture, the geometry, the acoustics, the light, the ritual, all work together to create conditions in which the expanded consciousness the Egyptians were cultivating could more easily arise. They were building instruments for the development of consciousness, and what they were trying to develop was exactly what quantum physics is now telling us may be the most fundamental feature of reality: awareness itself in its most expanded and undivided form. 3,000 years ago, in the forests and along the rivers of ancient India, a group of philosophers undertook what may be the most systematic investigation of consciousness in human history. They were not working with instruments. They were not running experiments on external objects. They were turning the instrument of awareness itself inward, using consciousness to investigate consciousness, and recording what they found in texts of extraordinary philosophical precision. Those texts are the Upanishads, and what they describe is a map of awareness, so detailed, so carefully articulated, so internally consistent that it has never been superseded, and that modern neuroscience and physics are only beginning to catch up to. The Vedic tradition identified 5 layers of the human being, what they called the koshas, or sheaths. Think of them as concentric layers, each one subtler than the last, each one closer to the ground of pure awareness. The outermost layer is the physical body, the Annamaya kosha, the food body, the layer made of matter, sustained by food, subject to birth and death and all the conditions of the physical world. This is what most people in the modern West identify as themselves: the body, the biological organism. The second layer is the energy body, the pranamaya kosha, the layer of vital force, of breath, of the subtle energies that animate the physical body. The Vedic tradition understood that the physical body is not the fundamental reality of the organism, that beneath and within the physical structure there is a field of energy that gives it life, that shapes its health and vitality, and that continues in some form even when the physical body ceases. The third layer is the mental body, the Manomaya Kosha, the layer of thought, emotion, memory and perception, the layer that most people in the modern world identify as their mind, the stream of thoughts and feelings and images and reactions that constitutes ordinary waking experience. The fourth layer is the wisdom body, the Vijnanamaya Kosha, the layer of discriminating intelligence, the capacity not merely to think and feel, but to observe the thinking and feeling, to step back from the stream of mental activity and recognize it as a stream rather than as the totality of what you are. This is the layer that the Vedic tradition associated with the beginning of real self-knowledge, the capacity to distinguish between the contents of awareness and awareness itself. And the fifth layer, the innermost sheath, the one closest to the ground of pure being, is the bliss body, the Anandamaya Kosha, the layer of deep rest, of profound peace, of the quiet joy that arises when the activity of the outer layers temporarily ceases, as it does in deep dreamless sleep, or in deep meditation, or in moments of spontaneous stillness that arise in the midst of ordinary life. Beyond all five layers, not a layer itself, but the ground in which all five layers appear, is what the Vedic tradition calls the Atman, pure awareness, consciousness itself, prior to all content, prior to all experience, prior to all the objects that appear within it, the witness that is never itself witnessed, the knowing that underlies all particular acts of knowing, and the central teaching of the Upanishads, the teaching that Schrödinger recognized in quantum mechanics, that Oppenheimer recognized in the desert, is this: the Atman, the individual pure awareness, is not separate from Brahman, the universal consciousness. They are one. The awareness that is reading these words right now, the awareness that you experience as your innermost self, is the same awareness that is the ground of the entire universe. Tattvam Asi, that thou art. One of the four great statements of the Upanishads. You, not the body, not the mind, not the personality, not the biography, but the pure awareness that underlies all of those, are that. The ground, the field, the consciousness in which the universe arises. This is not a belief to be accepted on faith. The Vedic tradition was explicit about this. It is something to be directly verified. Through practice, through investigation, through the systematic turning of awareness back on itself, until the ground is recognized, not as a concept, not as a philosophy, but as the direct, immediate, undeniable reality of what you are. Something is happening to your understanding of consciousness, because at some level, this recognition is beginning, not as a belief, as an experience, as the beginning of seeing something that was always there that you simply did not have the framework to recognize. The Vedic tradition mapped this territory, and it left, encoded in its texts and its practices, detailed instructions for navigating it. Here is an experiment that has been performed thousands of times in laboratories around the world, with results so consistently extraordinary that the physics community has simply accepted them as fact, while quietly setting aside the philosophical implications. Take two particles, entangle them, bring them into a quantum relationship in which their properties are correlated, then separate them. Send one to one side of the room, send the other to the other side, or send one to the other side of the city, or in experiments that have now been performed, to the other side of the planet. Now measure one of them, determine its spin, or its polarization, or some other quantum property. The moment you make that measurement, The moment the wave function collapses and a definite result appears, the other particle, regardless of the distance between them, instantly acquires the corresponding property. Instantly, not after a delay, not after a signal travels between them at the speed of light. Instantly, simultaneously, as if the distance between them does not exist. As if, at some level of reality, they are still one thing. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance. He spent years trying to prove it was impossible, that it violated the principles of special relativity, that no signal could travel faster than light, that the apparent correlation must be the result of hidden variables that the quantum mechanical description was missing. In 1964, the physicist John Bell devised a mathematical test that could determine, in principle, whether Einstein was right. And the experiments that followed, beginning in the 1970s and continuing with increasing precision to the present day, consistently showed that Einstein was wrong. The correlations are real. The entanglement is real. The two particles, regardless of the distance between them, are connected in a way that transcends space, that operates outside the ordinary framework of cause and effect, of signal and receiver, of here and there. What does this mean? It means that the universe, at its most fundamental level, is non-local, that the apparent separation between things, the sense that you are here and everything else is there, that the boundaries between objects are real and fundamental, is a feature of the level of reality we experience in ordinary life, not of the deeper level from which that ordinary reality emerges. The physicist Bernard d'Espagnat, who spent his career working on the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics, coined the term veiled reality for the deeper level that quantum entanglement points toward. He argued that quantum mechanics reveals the existence of a deeper reality that is non-local, that is not composed of separate objects, that cannot be directly perceived, but whose existence is implied by the correlations we observe. A reality that is, in his word, veiled, hidden behind the surface of the world we experience, but undeniably present in the mathematics of the physics we have verified. Veiled reality, the hidden ground, the undivided field beneath the apparent multiplicity of separate things. The Vedic tradition calls it Brahman. The Egyptian tradition calls it the field of Netta. The physicist Bohm calls it the implicate order. The physicist Wheeler calls it the participatory universe. The physicist d'Espagnat calls it veiled reality. These are not the same theory, but they are all pointing at the same thing, a level of reality prior to separation, prior to the division between observer and observed, prior to the multiplicity of objects we take to be fundamental. And here is what makes this personally significant. If the universe is non-local at its most fundamental level, if the apparent separation between things is a feature of the surface, not the depth, then the sense of isolation you experience as an individual is not the final truth of what you are. There is a field. It connects everything. It is what you are made of, at the level below what physics can directly measure. And the ancient traditions, Egyptian, Vedic and others, described it, worked with it, and developed practices for accessing it directly, not just as a concept, but as a lived reality. This is what is happening to your understanding of consciousness. The field is becoming visible, not because something new is being added, but because something old is being remembered. You might ask a reasonable question at this point. If the ancient traditions understood all of this, if the Egyptians and the Vedic philosophers and the other great wisdom traditions of the world mapped the nature of consciousness with such precision, developed practices for working with it, built civilizations around transmitting this understanding, why did the modern world lose it? Why did it take until the 21st century for physics to begin rediscovering what was apparently known 3,000 years ago? This is a profound question, and the ancient traditions themselves, with what seems, in retrospect, like extraordinary foresight, offered an answer. The Vedic tradition describes the cycles of time as the yugas, vast epochs of thousands of years in which the quality of human consciousness and civilization rises and falls in a great cycle. The highest age, the Satya Yuga, or Golden Age, is a time of clarity, of direct perception of the deeper nature of reality, of easy access to the field of pure consciousness that underlies the world of appearances. The lowest age, the Kali Yuga, is a time of maximum density, maximum separation, maximum identification with the surface of reality at the expense of the depth. A time when the connection to the field is most obscured, when the noise of the material world most effectively drowns out the signal of the deeper reality. The Vedic tradition placed us, for much of the last several thousand years, in the Kali Yuga, the age of maximum forgetting, the age in which the wisdom of the higher cycles was preserved only in fragments, in texts, in traditions, in the practices of small communities that maintain the flame across the long darkness. But the yugas are not static. They cycle, they turn, and many scholars of the Vedic tradition argue that the cycle is turning now, that the long descent into density and separation has reached its lowest point, and the movement back toward clarity and integration has begun. That the rediscovery of consciousness as the ground of physical reality, first in quantum physics, then in neuroscience, now beginning to emerge in the culture at large, is not a coincidence. It is the signature of a turning point, the beginning of the return. The Egyptian tradition encoded a similar understanding in its concept of the precession of the equinoxes. The great 26,000-year cycle of the Earth's rotation that the Egyptians tracked with extraordinary precision, and that they believed governed the rise and fall of human civilization's access to higher knowledge. The Great Year, they called it, a cosmic cycle so vast that it dwarfed ordinary human history, but one whose phases were as real and as determining as the seasons of the annual year. Whether you accept the specific frameworks of the yugas or the precession, the underlying observation is consistent across traditions. The quality of human consciousness changes over vast timescales. There are ages of clarity and ages of obscuration, and the traditions that survived the long obscuration, that preserved the knowledge through the Kali Yuga, that encoded it in texts and temples and initiatory lineages, did so precisely because they understood that a time would come when it would be needed again. That time, many traditions believed, is now. And this is why something is happening to your understanding of consciousness right now. Not just to you individually, though the shift is always experienced individually, always felt as a personal change in the quality of perception and understanding, but to the species as a whole, to the collective human mind that is, slowly and unevenly, and with great difficulty, beginning to remember what it has forgotten. The physics is pointing at it. The ancient traditions preserve the map. And something in you, something deeper than the thinking mind, something that operates at the level of the field, is recognizing it, is responding to it, is beginning to orient toward the source that has been there all along. This is not comfortable. The shift from identifying with the surface to recognizing the depth is not a smooth or easy transition. It involves the dissolution of certainties that have organized your inner life for years or decades. It involves encountering aspects of reality that your existing frameworks cannot accommodate. It involves sitting with questions that have no easy answers, but it is real. And it is, in the view of every ancient tradition that mapped this territory, the most important journey a human being can undertake. The ancient traditions did not simply describe the nature of consciousness. They were practical. They developed over thousands of years of accumulated experience, specific approaches for navigating the shift that you are beginning to experience, specific practices, specific orientations, specific ways of relating to the inner life that facilitate the recognition of the field rather than obscuring it. These were not arbitrary rituals or cultural preferences. They were technologies developed through systematic experimentation, refined across generations, tested against the direct experience of practitioners who verified their effects and passed them on to those who came after. The modern world has largely lost both the practices and the understanding of why they work. But the knowledge is preserved, and in the context of what physics and neuroscience are now discovering about the nature of consciousness, it is more legible than it has been in centuries. The first prescription across virtually every tradition is the practice of stillness, not the absence of activity, not the suppression of thought, but the cultivation of the capacity to rest in awareness itself, to be conscious without being identified with the contents of consciousness. The Egyptians call this the practice of silence, a specific discipline of the inner life in which the ordinary mental activity is allowed to settle, like sediment settling in disturbed water, until the underlying clarity becomes visible. The Vedic tradition developed this into the most sophisticated system of meditation in human history. Hundreds of distinct practices, each designed to work with a specific aspect of the inner life, each targeting a specific layer of the kosher system, all ultimately oriented toward the direct recognition of the Atman as the ground of awareness. The foundational practice is simple in its description and profound in its effect. Sit, be still. Observe what arises in consciousness without identifying with it. Notice the awareness that is prior to what arises. Rest in that awareness. Modern neuroscience has now begun to verify what these traditions claimed their practices produced. Studies on long-term meditators, people who have practiced for thousands of hours over years or decades, show structural changes in the brain that correspond to the qualities the traditions described. Increased capacity for present moment awareness, reduced reactivity to stress, enhanced connectivity between regions associated with self-awareness and with the processing of experience, and, most significantly, reduced activity in the default mode network, the brain network associated with the constant self-referential chatter of the ordinary thinking mind. The default mode network is the neural basis of what the Vedic tradition calls the ego, the constructed sense of being a separate self, bounded in space and time, with a particular history and a particular future to defend. When it quiets, what the traditions describe as the ground of awareness becomes more accessible. Not because it was absent before, but because the noise that was drowning it out has diminished. The second prescription is the practice of inquiry, the turning of attention back on itself. The question, who is aware? Not what is being experienced, but what is the nature of the awareness in which experience arises? This question, pursued as direct investigation rather than philosophical exercise, leads to the same recognition across every tradition. The awareness doing the inquiring cannot be found as an object. It is what remains when everything that can be observed is recognized as appearing within awareness, rather than as awareness itself. The third prescription is the practice of recognizing the field in the other. The Egyptian tradition encoded this in the understanding that the same Nita, the same divine intelligence, that is the ground of your awareness, is the ground of every other being's awareness. If consciousness is one field appearing as many, then every relationship is the field relating to itself. These three, stillness, inquiry, and recognition of the field in the other, are the foundation, the practices that make all the others possible. And they are available to you now, in the life you're already living, in the awareness you already are. You came to this video with a question. Perhaps it was explicit, a specific thing you wanted to understand about consciousness, about ancient wisdom, about what physics has discovered. Perhaps it was implicit, a vague sense of something shifting, something opening, something that needed to be followed, but that you didn't yet have the words for. Either way, you have now been given a map. Not a complete map, no video, no book, no single encounter with this material can provide that. But an orientation, a set of coordinates, a way of understanding the shift that is happening to your understanding of consciousness that places it in a larger context. The context of what the most advanced physics of our era has discovered, and the context of what the most rigorous wisdom traditions of human history already knew. Here is what that map says, in its simplest form. Consciousness is not what your brain produces. The most serious physics of the 20th and 21st centuries points toward a deeper description. Consciousness is the field in which the brain and the body and the physical universe appears. It is the ground, not the product. It is prior to the separation between observer and observed, prior to the division between you and everything else, prior to the sense of being a bounded individual in a world of other bounded individuals. The ancient traditions, Egyptian, Vedic and others, understood this. They mapped it with extraordinary precision. They developed practices for verifying it directly, not as a belief, but as a lived reality. And they encoded what they found in texts and temples and symbols and initiatory traditions, preserving it across thousands of years of history so that it would be available at the moment when it was needed. That moment is now. And what this means for you, practically, concretely, in the life you are living, is simpler than any of the philosophy we have explored. It means that the restlessness you feel, the sense that something is missing, the questions you cannot stop asking, are not symptoms of something wrong with you. They are the beginning of the recognition. They are the field pulling at the edge of the framework you have been using to understand yourself and your life. They are the first movement of the inquiry that the Vedic tradition described as the most important inquiry a human being can undertake. It means that the moments of clarity that have come to you, the instants of expanded perception, the glimpses of something larger, the times when the ordinary sense of being a separate self temporarily dissolved and something quieter was there, were not accidents or anomalies. They were recognitions, brief clearings in the ordinary cloud cover of the thinking mind, through which the underlying reality became visible for a moment. It means that stillness is not a luxury. It is not something to pursue when life gets less busy, when the children are grown, when the work slows down. It is the most urgent practice available to you right now, because it is the only practice that directly addresses the source of the restlessness, the identification with the surface at the expense of the depth. And it means that the ancient traditions were not primitive attempts to explain a world that modern science has since explained better. They were systematic investigations of a dimension of reality that modern science is only now beginning to approach. And they produced results that modern science is only beginning to verify. You are not late to this understanding. You are exactly on time. The shift in consciousness that the ancient traditions predicted, that quantum physics is confirming, that you are beginning to feel in your own inner life, is not something that happens to other people, in other places, at other times. It happens here. It happens now. It happens in the awareness that is reading these words. Something is happening to your understanding of consciousness, and now you know why. Not because you have been told, because you are beginning to remember. This is Sacred Flame TV. If this opens something in you, share it with someone who is asking the same questions, because the field that connects everything also connects us to each other. And some recognitions are more powerful when they are shared. Music by Pavel Bikirov from Pixabay.